If we merge some light year in a titanic quaking collision, perhaps we both see something new.
Okay, this is coming from on page 22 out of Patel's book. So I'm going to read a little bit and then let you respond to this. So there's a little background here. It says, he's talking about market economies. He's like, I am not, however, arguing for a world without markets. The idea of a market as a place in which people with diverse needs exchange goods is one that can be found in every human civilization. What characterizes today's market is exchange not driven by needs, but by profit. It is pure ideology to think that the best way for society to function is to let the market seek profit, and that the best way for markets to function is with minimal interference. The terms on which markets operate are set by the powerful. Our tragedy is to have let this happen. I think the very last sentence in there is the one I think that's the most fascinating. And it's the idea of markets aren't bad. Human culture has been doing for a long time. But what happens when you let the powerful and the wealthy set the terms of the market? And why does everybody else let it happen? What do you think? How does that play out both in society and in the church?
Yeah. And I'll add another quote to that he mentioned. He said, the blindness here is our faith in a faculty that so routinely betrays us, and the demonstrably false promise that profit-driven markets can point to true value. And I think there's that idea of betrayal here. Like, the powerful may not notice how we're being betrayed because they're benefiting from it. It's really hard for me when I pour my cup of coffee in the morning to know how somebody in Africa may be being betrayed by all of that went into, took place to get me that cup of coffee. And so that, and again, you see that we're just simply not aware of that. You see that in even in throughout church history. Like, after the apostles died, the church bishops began consolidating their authority, and then you had these church councils that determined orthodoxy, and these were made up of very powerful people. And then even later, like with Origen, he's like one of the main guys leading this, and all of a sudden later he's deemed a heretic by somebody else who's in power hundreds of years later. It's like, and so I just think, like, we need to recognize that, and maybe somebody who's in power came up with a great idea theologically. Maybe they're coming up with some great ideas economically. I'm not speaking to that right now, but I think we just need to at least recognize the fact that the powerful are the ones who make these rules. And then we need to be cautious about really fully buying into that, especially when the threat of the sword is used against those who would question it.
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges. I mean, this quote, I agree with his observation, but that very last section where it says, our tragedy is to have let this happen. Is that actually a perspective of privilege? Like, in some ways, is the idea that, like, we could have done something to stop this? And that becomes a fascinating question. I mean, people ask that regarding the transatlantic slave trade. Well, why didn't the enslaved Africans just revolt and stop? And so it becomes that question of, are you blaming the victim here with this quote? Or are you being honest? The whole point is that the powerful have the power, and so they can set the system however they want, and they control the people who can then subdue and oppress those who can't. And so, so what do you think about that? Is it actually the tragedy that we let it happen? What about in the church? Is it a tragedy that we let this happen? Or is this just something that we have to live with?
I mean, it's the reality that we find ourselves in. So I think we need to be aware of that. And then we need to begin out of that listening to people on the other underside. We need to start educating ourselves, and we can't just pretend like it didn't happen. It did happen. So now where do we find ourselves? Well, we find ourselves with a great opportunity these days where people are writing about these things, and people are educating us about these things. And so we need to have the humility to put ourselves in a posture of learning and listening. And that's something that I think, especially like a lot of the liberation theologies are offering us today, are different voices from people on the underside, from all kinds of different contexts of how they're seeing from their perspective. And we need to not, again, the powerful create the rules here. The powerful Christians will often tell them, well, your perspective is illegitimate. You can be a Black person and talk about your theology as long as you agree with all of these 5 points that we set up. It's like, no, you need to like not give them the rules. You need to listen to what they have to say and put yourself in a posture of humility, learning from them.
Yeah, with this question of our tragedies to let it happen, I can't help but think, especially in the history of the church, like the first thing that came to my mind was Constantine. And like with the Council of Nicaea, I mean, it was the first time that a non-Christian person became essentially dictated how this council determined their answers. And I can't think, man, how did they let that happen? And I'm like, why didn't somebody do something? And then I realized, well, because Constantine would have killed that person.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things you're like, man, was there a way around this? Without trying to murder Constantine. I mean, it really begs the question, like what could they have done something different? I'm not sure they could have. So.
Yeah. There are moments in church history, like, Abelard versus Anselm. What if we had followed Abelard instead of Anselm? How would the rest of church history look differently?
Oh, that's a
whole nother question.
Yeah, that's a whole other podcast right there.
Yeah.